For years, quiet murmurs followed Bill Anderson through the glittering halls of Nashville. Fans adored his calm voice, that soft whisper that made every lyric feel like a secret, shared just between friends. But behind the charm and the gentle smile, there was something else, a mystery that seemed to hover just beyond the lights. The man who told stories for a living had one story he never told. And it wasn't until his later years that he finally began to let the truth slip through the cracks of silence. In the world of country music, few figures have managed to embody both success and secrecy the way Bill Anderson did. His songs reached millions, his words moved hearts, but his personal life remained like an unopened letter, sealed, untouchable, waiting for time to reveal what fame had hidden. The rumors, of course, were easy to dismiss at first. Country music is a town built on whispers, and Nashville's gossip mill spins faster than any record. But this was different. The stories about Bill weren't about wild nights or public feuds. They were about something far more delicate, a connection that ran deeper than most ever realized. People often spoke of him with reverence, not curiosity. He wasn't the kind of celebrity who made headlines for scandals or controversies. Yet, in the quiet corners of studios and the backstage corridors of the Grand Ole Opry, there were conversations that always led back to one question. What was really behind that friendship between Bill Anderson and a rising voice named Linda Davis? The question hung in the air for decades, never fully answered, never completely dismissed. To many, it seemed harmless, a mentor helping a younger artist find her place. But those who watched closely saw something more subtle, something that couldn't be explained away by professional courtesy. A look here, a gesture there, a lingering warmth in words that didn't sound rehearsed. And though neither of them ever spoke openly about it, that unspoken bond became part of Nashville's unrecorded history. Bill Anderson wasn't just another country artist. He was, and still is, one of the genre's greatest storytellers. Born James William Anderson III in Columbia, South Carolina, in 1937, he carried with him a kind of sincerity that set him apart even in his youth. While other singers fought to be the loudest in the room, Anderson made his mark by being the quietest. His nickname, Whisperin' Bill, wasn't just a gimmick. It was a reflection of his entire approach to life and music. He believed the most powerful emotions didn't need to be shouted. They only needed to be felt. That whisper became his signature, the sound of empathy, of understanding, of a man who could translate heartbreak into melody without ever raising his voice. His songs like City Lights and Still became instant classics, not because they were loud or flashy, but because they were real. He wasn't singing to his listeners, he was confiding in them. And perhaps that's why the whispers about his private life carried such weight. People felt like they knew him, but somehow they didn't. As his fame grew, so did his reputation as a gentleman of country music, the kind of artist who could fill a room without ever needing to dominate it. His presence at the Grand Ole Opry became almost sacred, a reminder of what authenticity looked like in a world obsessed with reinvention. Younger artists idolized him, not only for his career, but for his humility, for the way he could make you feel seen, even when he said very little. But even the most composed voices carry secrets, and behind that soft-spoken exterior was a man who had lived through heartbreak, rejection, and the weight of an industry that demanded constant reinvention. The same sensitivity that made him such a remarkable writer also made him vulnerable. And it was that vulnerability that would one day draw him toward a young artist whose dreams reminded him of his own. Linda Davis. For years, Bill's songs were stories about love found and lost, but in his own life, the most significant chapter was one he never set to music. The connection between him and Linda wasn't born out of fame or ambition. It was born out of recognition. The kind that happens when two souls meet at the exact moment they need each other most. Yet for all the beauty in that connection, there was also tension. A quiet knowing that some bonds are too complicated for the world to understand. And so, he stayed silent. For decades, he let the rumors drift while he kept his focus on the music. To outsiders, his silence looked like evasion. But to those who truly knew him, it was something else entirely. Protection. Protection for her, for himself, and for the fragile truth they both shared. And that silence, that deliberate choice to say nothing, became the very thing that kept their story alive for generations. But to understand why that silence mattered so much, to understand the weight of what Bill Anderson carried, we have to go back to where it all began. Back to a young man in South Carolina, before the fame, before the nickname, before the whispers. Back to the start of a voice that would one day move mountains with a single word. Long before the world knew him as Whisperin' Bill, he was just James William Anderson III, a boy from Columbia, South Carolina, who loved stories. The son of a humble family, Bill's first stage wasn't a concert hall. It was the front porch, where he'd sit with a guitar and try to make sense of the world through songs. Even then, his voice wasn't booming or dramatic. It was thoughtful, measured. The sound of someone who didn't just sing to people, but with them. By the time he reached his early 20s, Anderson had begun writing songs that carried a depth beyond his years. One of those songs, City Lights, would change his life forever. When Ray Price turned it into a #1 hit, Nashville suddenly knew the name, Bill Anderson, a songwriter with the rare ability to capture emotion in the simplest words. But for Anderson, success never meant noise. While others celebrated loudly, he watched quietly, already thinking about the next story to tell. In the golden era of country music, artists often chased fame with a kind of feverish ambition. But Anderson moved differently. His success came not from trying to stand out, but from daring to stay real. He didn't wear his heart on his sleeve, he stitched it into his lyrics. Songs like Po Folks and Still weren't just hits, they were mirrors, reflections of the ordinary lives listeners lived every day. He sang of longing, loss, and quiet perseverance, the kind of themes that never age. And yet, behind all that gentle wisdom was a man who understood how fragile dreams could be. The music business, for all its glamour, could be cruel. Anderson had seen bright talents fade, promises break, and careers crumble. Perhaps that's why he took so much care in mentoring others. He knew how easily a voice could be lost in the noise of Nashville. His empathy was born from experience. He wasn't just protecting the genre, he was protecting the dreamers inside it. By the 1960s, he had become more than a singer. He was an institution. His calm presence on television, his steady hand at the Opry, and his reputation as one of the good ones made him beloved by audiences and peers alike. But the price of that perfection was solitude. Fame can be loud, but it can also be lonely. And Anderson carried that loneliness quietly, with the same grace he brought to everything else. That loneliness, that quiet understanding of what it means to be both admired and unseen, would become the invisible thread connecting him to Linda Davis years later. She reminded him of something he'd nearly forgotten: the raw hunger of a young artist just trying to be heard. As decades passed, Anderson's whisper became more than a nickname. It became a symbol. It meant resilience. It meant control. It meant survival in an industry that rarely forgives softness. But beneath that control was still a man who felt deeply, who remembered the sting of rejection and the ache of dreams deferred. So when he saw that same fire and that same fragility in Linda Davis, something in him shifted. He wasn't just seeing a talented singer, he was seeing a reflection of himself. And that recognition, unspoken but undeniable, would change both their lives forever. When Linda Davis first walked into a Nashville recording studio, she didn't carry the confidence of a star. She carried the weight of every small-town dreamer who came before her. Raised in Texas, where country music was as natural as breathing, Linda grew up listening to voices like Bill Anderson's. Voices that told stories that felt like they were meant just for her. There was something in the way he sang, the calm, the truth, the quiet ache, that resonated deep in her soul, long before their paths would cross. She wasn't born into privilege or connections. Her beginnings were simple. A girl with a voice that could silence a crowd, and a heart that refused to settle for ordinary. In the smoky corners of local bars and church halls, Linda honed her voice until every note carried the kind of sincerity that couldn't be faked. She didn't just perform country music, she lived it. By the time she made her way to Nashville, the industry was already crowded with dreamers chasing the same spotlight. But there was something different about Linda. She wasn't trying to mimic anyone. She was trying to be heard. Her early demos floated around Music Row, those soft but powerful vocals catching the attention of people who've long since stopped being impressed. Nashville has a way of hardening even the kindest hearts. But Linda's voice somehow broke through that cynicism. It wasn't perfect. It was honest. And that honesty was what drew Bill Anderson's attention. At the time, Anderson was already a legend. His influence stretched across generations, and young artists often sought his approval the way preachers seek gospel. He'd seen countless hopefuls come and go, but something about Linda Davis stopped him in his tracks. Maybe it was her tone, clear yet trembling with emotion. Or maybe it was that he saw in her what he once was, raw potential wrapped in quiet humility. Their first meeting wasn't the thunderclap that legends usually start with. It was understated. Two artists from different worlds crossing paths in a studio where dreams often began and ended in the same day. But that simple meeting would mark the beginning of a connection that would reshape both their lives. Anderson wasn't looking for anyone to guide. He had already done more than his share of mentoring over the years. But something about Linda stirred that old creative fire in him again. She reminded him of the power of new beginnings, of voices that still believed in the magic of music. He once said that songwriting was like catching lightning in a bottle, and in Linda, he saw that spark again, something pure and unjaded by fame. For Linda, meeting Bill Anderson was more than a professional encounter. It was validation. Here was a man whose songs she'd grown up admiring, now standing before her not as an idol, but as a human being who believed in her potential. He didn't flatter her or fee her empty promises. Instead, he offered something far more valuable, his time and his truth. In the quiet of those studio sessions, something began to form. Not romance, but resonance. Two souls connected by a shared understanding of what it meant to pour your heart into music and still be misunderstood by the world outside it. Bill's mentorship didn't come in the form of lectures or advice. He taught through presence, through subtle gestures the way he'd adjust a lyric to make it feel more alive, or how he'd close his eyes when she sang, not to correct her, but to feel her performance. For Linda, those moments meant more than any chart position ever could. And yet, as the two continued to work together, the whispers began. Nashville, ever watchful, started to talk. Rumors drifted through the grapevine. Harmless at first, then more curious. People speculated about their closeness, about why a man like Bill Anderson, decades into his career, seemed to invest so much of his time in a young, rising artist. Some said it was purely musical chemistry. Others weren't so sure. But if the noise around them grew louder, neither of them seemed to hear it. Their focus remained on the craft, the songs, the emotion that drew them together in the first place. Because, for both of them, music wasn't just a profession, it was the language of survival. What Linda didn't know then, however, was that the man mentoring her had his own storms to weather. Bill Anderson, the pillar of calmness to the outside world, was quietly unraveling inside. Decades of fame, heartbreak, and loss had left their marks, and the soft-spoken songwriter, who once seemed unshakable, was beginning to question what it had all been for. And in that moment of doubt, Linda's presence became something more than inspiration. It became salvation. The bond between Bill Anderson and Linda Davis wasn't something either of them planned. It wasn't built on fame, headlines, or ambition. It was built on timing. Sometimes, life has a way of bringing two people together, not to change their paths, but to remind them who they are. And that's exactly what happened. Bill had spent years mastering the art of control, keeping his emotions neatly folded beneath layers of professionalism. But Linda's energy disarmed him. She carried with her the same mix of confidence and vulnerability that he once had as a young dreamer. Her laughter filled spaces he didn't even realize had gone quiet. It wasn't love in the way gossip magazines love to twist it. It was something softer, rarer, a friendship built on mutual respect and silent understanding. In interviews, Bill would later describe Linda as the kind of artist who reminds you why you started. Those words, simple as they were, carried a weight few understood. He didn't just mean her voice, he meant her spirit. She reignited something in him that fame had long since dulled. But Nashville isn't kind to bonds it doesn't understand. The town runs on stories, and when stories run dry, people make them up. Soon, the whispers that once hovered in studio corners started spilling into headlines. Is there more than friendship between Bill Anderson and Linda Davis? The question was everywhere. Whispered by fans, printed by tabloids, speculated about on radio talk shows. Both of them denied any romantic connection, and rightly so. But denials rarely silence curiosity. They only feed it. The more they tried to move forward with their work, the more people seemed to pull them back into a narrative they never wrote. And yet, amid the noise, something beautiful was happening. Their musical collaborations began to flourish. Bill helped Linda refine her lyrical instincts, while Linda brought a fresh, emotional edge to his seasoned writing. Together, they created songs that didn't just sound good, they felt like truth. Each lyric seemed to carry a piece of their shared experience, their unspoken connection, their trust. For Linda, the mentorship became a lifeline. The industry was competitive, and being a woman in country music at the time meant constantly having to prove yourself twice as hard. Bill's belief in her wasn't just career support, it was validation that she wasn't just another pretty voice, but a storyteller in her own right. Still, the public rarely sees what's real. Fans only saw the polished performances, the shared smiles on stage, the harmony that seemed too perfect to be purely professional. And as with every misunderstood partnership in music history, their closeness became a canvas for speculation. But the truth, the quiet, unspoken truth, was that both of them were finding healing in each other's presence. Bill, in his 60s, was facing personal heartbreaks and fading spotlights, while Linda was still fighting her way toward recognition. Their lives intersected at a time when both needed strength and found it unexpectedly in each other. Behind the scenes, though, the pressure was mounting. Friends and colleagues began advising them to create distance. Not because there was guilt, but because perception in the music industry is often more dangerous than reality. Bill resisted at first, unwilling to let public opinion dictate something so genuine. But over time, even he began to realize that silence wasn't always enough to shield what mattered most. The moment that changed everything wasn't explosive. It wasn't a confrontation or scandal. It was quiet, almost poetic. One evening after a performance, as they stood backstage surrounded by applause, Bill turned to Linda and simply said, "You've got it now. You don't need me anymore." It was both a compliment and a goodbye. Linda didn't respond, not with words at least. She just smiled, her eyes heavy with the kind of gratitude that can't be spoken. In that moment, both of them understood what they had shared. A chapter of connection, written not in headlines, but in harmony. And though the world may never stop speculating about what really happened between them, those who knew them best understood the truth. It was never about scandal. It was about soul. But every story has a turning point, and for both Bill and Linda, what came next would test not just their bond, but their legacies. Time has a way of softening everything. Memories, regrets, even the weight of secrets long kept. By the time Bill Anderson reached 87, he had lived through every transformation country music could offer. The world around him had changed. New stars, new stages, new definitions of what country even meant. But Bill remained, the quiet poet in the corner, his voice still gentle, his wisdom deeper than ever. For decades, his silence about many things had become part of his mystique. He wasn't one to explain himself or to chase headlines. But as he entered his later years, there was a shift. Not a confession, not an exposé, but a kind of emotional clarity, as if he had finally found peace with all that had gone unsaid. Fans noticed it first in interviews, then in his writing, and finally in his rare, unguarded moments on stage. The man who once spoke in whispers now spoke with reflection, not louder, but clearer. When asked about the people who had shaped his journey, Anderson didn't name names the way most would. Instead, he told stories about chance encounters that became lifelines, about voices that carried truth when the world demanded polish, about loyalty, that rare and precious currency in a business built on fleeting fame. And though he never mentioned her directly in the beginning, every word carried the ghost of a familiar figure, Linda Davis. There was one particular evening, a quiet tribute event in Nashville celebrating his 70 years in music, when Anderson, standing before a packed room of artists and admirers, finally allowed himself to speak freely about the ones who walked beside me when I needed steady ground. His voice trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the gravity of time. "You don't always realize, when you're in the middle of your story," he said softly, "how much the people you meet are shaping it. Some stay for a moment, some stay for a lifetime, even if they're not always beside you." It wasn't a revelation in the traditional sense. There were no dramatic pauses, no headlines waiting to erupt. But for those who had followed his life, those who knew the whispers, it felt like the closest thing to truth they would ever hear. It was an acknowledgement, subtle but unmistakable, of the bonds that had defined him. Anderson went on to speak about how music had always been his truest form of expression. "The songs say what I can't," he admitted. "Every lyric I ever wrote was a piece of something I couldn't say out loud." He spoke of the loneliness of fame, the beauty of mentorship, and the bittersweet ache of seeing those you've guided surpass you. The inevitable circle of art and time. Some in the audience wiped away tears as he continued, reflecting not only on his own journey, but on the generations he had lifted. And though her name was never uttered, Linda Davis's presence lingered in every word. She was part of that story, the living proof of what mentorship, faith, and shared artistry could build. In later interviews, Anderson became even more candid about the emotional undercurrents of his life. When a journalist once asked him whether he ever regretted keeping certain parts of his life private, he smiled, that same slow, knowing smile that had charmed fans for decades. "You can't regret silence," he said. "Sometimes silence is the only way to protect something pure." It was a profound statement, one that reframed everything. What the world had once seen as secrecy was, in truth, stewardship. Anderson had spent his entire career protecting what mattered: the dignity of the music, the integrity of relationships, and the sincerity of emotion. His whisper wasn't about shyness, it was about reverence. He believed that some truths deserved to be spoken softly, so they could be heard clearly. As he grew older, those who had once speculated began to understand. The connection between Anderson and Davis wasn't built on scandal, but on shared spirit. It was the kind of bond that time couldn't erode, because it was founded on something bigger than fame: respect, gratitude, faith in one another's gifts. Linda Davis herself remained gracious whenever Anderson's name arose in conversation. In interviews, she referred to him as one of the truest gentlemen this business ever had. And in her performances, especially those rooted in the traditional sounds of Nashville, listeners could almost hear the echoes of his influence. The phrasing, the poise, the subtle emotional control, all hallmarks of Anderson's own style, lived on through her voice. Anderson's final revelation, if it could be called that, wasn't a single statement, but a culmination, a lifetime of meaning distilled into wisdom. "You realize," he once told a young songwriter backstage at the Opry, "that the real legacy isn't your songs or your trophies. It's the people who keep singing after you stop." Those words, though simple, carried the weight of everything. They were his quiet farewell, his understanding that influence, not fame, was what truly lasted. As he approached his 87th year, Anderson began appearing less frequently in public. But when he did, there was a calm around him, a peace that comes only from having said what needed to be said, and having left the rest to time. He no longer dodged questions about his past. He simply smiled and let the silence speak. In that silence, the truth lived, not as rumor, but as reverence. Because in the end, Whisperin' Bill didn't need to explain himself. His life had already told the story. Through every lyric, every friendship, every quiet act of guidance, he had built a legacy that didn't rely on noise. And as his voice, soft but sure, continued to echo through Nashville's history, one could almost hear the final message hidden between the lines. A truth not about mystery or confession, but about grace. that the strongest bonds are not the ones shouted from rooftops. They are the ones whispered, cherished, and carried gently through time. She belonged.